Hey, it's Joe. I'm glad you're here, and if you could do me a little favor and please subscribe, if you haven't already. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers. I would greatly appreciate it. If you're returning, you'll notice a new intro and new background sound. Hope you'll like it. Alright, let's get on with the stories. This happened a few years ago, and I figured I'd share it as I find myself wondering what happened almost every day. My friend and I were interested in investigating a nearby abandoned factory that had a fire happen in it many years ago. So we geared up, grabbing everything we could to make sure we would be okay going into this place. There was a shattered glass window at the back of the factory where we were going to enter the building. From the first time we pulled into the parking lot, she told me that she didn't like the feeling she was getting, so I pulled away from the building. We turned down the road, seeing a shadow with no features walking down the side of the building. His gait suggested he was injured, so I turned around, and he was closer this time. We turned around to leave again, with our eyes on him the entire time, and he was gone. We chose to leave at that very moment and try to find a new location. My friend started to become very silent and unresponsive to me talking to her. As we passed a few places, she started speaking in a monotone voice, staring straight ahead. The whole time she was telling me that someone hung themselves at this place, someone burnt to death here, someone shot someone here. Meanwhile, I tried to converse with her to no avail. We left the city we were in and pulled into a Walmart. As we were sitting there, she suddenly came to, asking where we were and what time it was and why we were there. She had no recollection of anything she had said or of any location we had visited. Then, I showed her a half-hour recording of her that I took on my old cell phone, and she was shocked and had to leave immediately. I went home and researched all the deaths she was talking about, and they were all accurate. "4 years ago, my ex and I decided to take a break from our jobs and pursue a lifelong ambition of mine, getting to know our great country a little better. I really wanted to see more of the States, as I've never left my home state, and was desperate to see what our country was all about since I've been a little girl. I'd put on a map everywhere I'd wanted to go, and with his help, devised a route that would take roughly 3.5 weeks and make it back, seeing a great portion of our country. Anyway, we started the trip, and everything was going great. It wasn't until about the 5th day in that our car suffered a puncture. So, we did the thing where we undo all the bolts and replace the wheel. Unfortunately, it traveled a little further, and as it turns out, the damage that had been done to the underside of the car was far more extensive than just the wheel. So at 4 a.m. in a state we didn't know, in the middle of nowhere, we had to call for help. The people at the call center let me know that help, due to our remoteness, would take a minimum of 2.5 hours, and told us that we had to get comfortable and not wait up, and that it could be even longer still depending on some of the factors. They were going to tow us to a garage in a town about 2 hours away, and we would go from there. So we waited, and we waited, and we waited. The cold night air was battering our faces. As you can imagine, after driving for about 6 hours straight, I really didn't want to stay in the car or be sat down and wanted to enjoy the cold night air. Despite my frustration, my ex, on the other hand, chose to stay in the vehicle and have a little catnap. I was looking around. It's your standard bit of highway. I looked past the tree line and wanted to make sure there was nothing nearby as I needed to pee. So I grabbed some tissues from the glove compartment and made my way into the woods. I walked around for around 5 minutes, trying to find a decent spot to do my business when I finally reached an adequate point. I squatted down, did what I needed to do, and partway through my stream, did I hear something. It sounded like footsteps approaching, leaves and twigs crunching underfoot. I looked around and saw nothing. I continued going, and just as I'm wiping and finishing up, I stand up, pull my trousers back on, and look around. The sound seems to be getting closer. Remember the context. It's technically either very late or very early, still dark outside, as I had to use my iPhone flashlight just to get there. And apparently someone is walking in the dark, who I can't see, with no light source making noise and coming close to me. I know it didn't sound right. I crouch down, stand perfectly still, and twist my head around frantically trying to listen while also trying to remain silent. I can't hear anything. I wait a little longer just to be sure that this person is gone. When I'm fairly confident after a few minutes that the sound must have all been in my head, do I quickly scoot up, dust off my pants, and start making my way at a sprint back towards my vehicle. When it's within seeing range, do I hear it again, but now the running is more pronounced. They run at breakneck speed, and I turn around with my iPhone flashlight in disbelief at who is doing this, and the sound is getting closer, but I can't see anyone. My adrenaline and fight or flight kicks in, and I ran at full speed to my vehicle, slammed the door, waking up my ex-boyfriend, and we both look into the woods. At the end of the tree line, there's some sort of shadow that flickers and is gone. I look to my boyfriend without saying a word, unsure if I had just seen what I'd seen, and wait for him to say something to confirm, just to make sure I'm not crazy. Remember, it's quite dark, so it was quite hard to see. Anyway, we have our hazard lights on, and by the light of the vehicle, do I just see it for that split second. I say, "Did you see something in the forest?" He looks at me with wide eyes and says, "You saw it too?" I asked him what he means, and after a moment's hesitation he says, "Like a shadow behind a tree," and then it was gone. I give him a slow nod, and we sit there in silence until the guy comes to tow our car. It was pretty disturbing, needless to say. I chose to do the drives during the day and not the night after this day. My grandpa told me this story about his mom. They were both extremely down-to-earth, honest people, so this is the only supernatural story that I fully believe. His mom had a display case full of china and silverware. If you've never seen something like this, imagine a bunch of glass cupboard-style doors made of glass. You couldn't touch any of the contents without opening the door. Also, it's a display case, which means that no one ever opens it unless they're bored of the display. So she's walking by this in her living room, and as soon as she just passes it, one of her favorite spoons crashes to the floor. My grandma described it much more than a fall. It was as if someone had thrown it to the ground with force. Shivers went down her spine. She quickly jumps around and sees what she expected, a spoon about 10 feet from the display case. She didn't know what else to do, so she opened one of the doors and put the spoon back where it belongs. When she shut the door, she gets a call and answers it to find out her brother had passed away. The craziest part to me is that a year after I heard this story, my close friend told me an almost identical story, instead with a fork. I do not and have never believed in anything supernatural, but I fully believe this and have spent a lot of time thinking about how this is possible. I don't fully believe it yet, but my best explanation for this is that our souls don't die and that they are always a part of our lives somehow. I was running on the trails at the Nathan Hale Homestead, an 18th century farmhouse and property of a Revolutionary War hero. This was in Connecticut, which is only about a 10-minute drive away from my grandmother's lake house. I could not find a map of the trails anywhere online, and there didn't seem to be any signage at this place, just a bunch of random mountain bike trails in the woods. I was only going to run 4 miles, so I estimated that I would run for about 30 minutes, using my watch to keep myself on track. So, I ran around the trails for a while, and nothing seemed too out of the ordinary. It was around 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, and the only sounds were the distant hums of Route 31, birds chirping, and the occasional squirrel or deer that scampered off whenever I came near. The trail seemed to wind around a lot. If not for my better-than-average directional skills, I could have easily gotten lost. About 20 minutes in, I saw something strange about 50 meters off. A finely polished and light-colored wooden coffin. I was a little weirded out, to say the least, and waited until I got closer for a better look. I rounded a corner where several old tree stumps blocked my view, only to find that the coffin had disappeared. Where it should have been, there was just a clump of ferns. Odd. I turned around shortly thereafter and made my way back to my car. I was maybe half a mile out when I heard a very distinctive knocking on a nearby tree. I was a little spooked but chalked it up to be a woodpecker or something. However, not 30 seconds later, there it was on a completely different area ahead of me. Exactly the same rhythm. Talk, talk to talk. I picked up the pace. The trail widened a little, and I could see way ahead to the entrance of the parking lot where my car was. There it was again, on a tree seemingly right next to me. I truly started freaking out and started to book it back to the lot. I was nearing the opening when time seemed to slow down. All of a sudden, it felt like the temperature dropped about 20 degrees. The birds stopped singing, and my simple Timex watch started to malfunction, making all sorts of beeping noises, and the numbers glitched on the screen. The beat sounded impossibly loud this time, like it were hacked into every surrounding tree with an axe. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me as I anticipated hearing the rhythm again. I burst into the parking lot, and everything went back to normal. The temperature was back in the mid-70s, and birds were chirping away. I looked at my watch only to discover that it had gone completely blank. I stood there and stared at it until it flashed 12 o'clock, Monday 101, January 1st. My watch had completely reset itself. It had never done this before. I got into the car and started the engine. The clock on the radio read 12 o'clock. That couldn't be right. It should have been around 9:30, 9:45 at the latest. So, I threw her in reverse, then backed up to where I could clearly make out the main road. However, as I was about to throw the car into drive, as it sat there, I had a sharp rapping sound on the back window, like someone hitting it with their knuckles. It was the same beat. There was no one else in the parking lot when I finished my run. No cars, nothing. I didn't dare look back and hightailed it back to my grandmother's house. I have no idea what could have caused this series of events, and I still cannot explain it to this day. This happened to my grandmother, and she swears up and down that what you are about to hear is true. Many years ago, she had an accident, as old ladies often do, and ended up breaking her hip. She had to be taken to the hospital, and it turned out that she had several problems with her, and it would take a long time for her to heal. Most of the healing needed to be done in the hospital in order to monitor her and assure she was receiving the proper care, and finally, a care home, a sort of intermediary between hospital and home, before she could finally be discharged. I went to visit her a few times, and the conditions were appalling. There were so many people crammed into such small wards, the air was toxic and suffocating, and I knew my grandmother wasn't enjoying it. However, it wasn't before long that she was moved to a much nicer, far more comfortable place in the care home. I went to visit her there one afternoon, asked her how her day was, brought her some snacks and flowers, and tried to cheer her up. I spoke with her all afternoon about all kinds of things, and just as I'm about to leave, she grabs my hand and looks me in the eye. "Don't go," she says. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you, but I keep putting it off because I think I'm going mad." I gave her a little smile and tell her it's all right, and that I'll always believe her. Probably. She looks around to see who's looking and hearing. Thankfully, there was no one else in the room at the time. As she was sitting up in bed, she squeezes my hand tightly and beckons me to come closer. And I do. She says, "There's a little girl who comes and plays in here at night. I don't know if she's one of the workers' children or something, but she's always here. She wakes me up when she skips across the room. She picks up things and puts them back, like any curious child. And after a few minutes, I hear her singing gently in the corridor and then disappeared." I look at her and ask, "Is that all?" And she nods but then says, "She's here every night at the same time, 2 a.m. My grandma is a very light sleeper, and at first I told her that it was all right, and that it was probably just a member of staff who had a child or something, trying my best to convince her. And my grandmother is no fool, and looked at me in the eye and said, "I think we both know what's going on here." And she was right. We were both confident it was a ghost, and I told her not to worry, and that it might not come back, for she was quite frightened of it. So she ignored it and carried on as I left. I don't visit her for 2 days due to work, and when I come back, I again strike up a conversation with her. She tells me all about how she's excited that she's going to leave, as she's been given permission to leave next week, and she was incredibly anxious to go home again. Just before I leave, she squeezes my hand and tells me again that the little ghost girl had returned, but then more curiously, that my jacket had disappeared. She said that when she woke up at the sound of the little ghost girl, at this time, she looked at her dead in the eye and just carried on skipping away. The thing is, I left my jacket on a chair next to my grandmother's bed, and when she woke up the next morning, it had been gone. She asked all of the day and night staff if they had moved it, but none of them seemed to be able to locate it. The days were ticking along quickly, and although I myself wasn't that concerned with the disappearance of my coat, as it was old and worn, my grandmother, with very little to do, had made it her mission to find what had happened to it. She was semi-mobile, as she had one of those frames, and she started scooting around the place, looking up and down, trying to desperately find where this coat was, which was very ill-advised, according to the nurses. She didn't find it, but the day before she left, she was growing increasingly annoyed and got in a bad temper with the nurses, saying that they must have moved it and not forgotten, and even accused one of them of stealing it. When she fell asleep, she awoke as usual to the sound of footsteps skipping across the floor. She opened her eyes and saw the little girl quickly dart past the door of her room, and just as she was about to close her eyes again, did she notice my coat resting gently on the chair. She was convinced that either the ghost girl had moved it and was returning it to her before her departure, or she had found where it had been lost and was giving it back. In any case, my grandmother thought it was a very nice gesture and was happy and calm with the ghost girl for one last time. She left the next day. Her health improved, and to this day, she is still fine. But the question in my mind remained about these strange happenings. So about a year later, when I had some free time, I decided to look into the place where this hospital care home was. It turns out that in 1910, this was a school that operated in the area. It wasn't until the Second World War that this school was hit by a bomb. Although there were no kids here when it happened, there was a family that lived next to the school, and all of the inhabitants of that house perished. I came to find out that a family of 4, a son, a daughter, and a mother and father, had all lived there and died. I know the girl was around 10 years old, and the son about 3, so it likely in my head that the girl could have attended the school very next door to her home, and that this is where she chooses to haunt. And it must be where she spent many an hour in fun times during her brief life on this plane. Little ghost girl, thanks for getting me my coat back. I hope you have a safe and peaceful existence. When I was a child, I woke up to footsteps on the roof of my apartment. As I lived on the top floor, it sounded like something was running across the roof. Being a young child and not really knowing when Christmas was, I ran into my parents' room as they slept and was excitedly telling them that Santa and his reindeer were on the roof. They woke up and told me to go back to sleep as it wasn't anywhere near Christmas. So I went back into my room and closed the door. I laid in my bed and clearly remembered a tall figure which was shadowy, but I can't remember any more of what happened after what I saw. After the event, all my life, I've seen shadow figures. I've had dreams of gray aliens and having medical-type experimentations done on me, and have woken up with scars that are perfect incisions that were made overnight and healed completely once I awoke. One time, I was in my grandparents' backyard around 1 o'clock or 2 a.m. with my Siberian husky and ex-girlfriend. We were sitting on a picnic bench just looking at the stars. I would constantly see stars in space that started moving back and forth, as if they were objects in space being flown by intelligence, and I was enjoying the nice night. They lived in a rural area with practically no light pollution, and you could see so many stars. It was quite beautiful and breathtaking. On this particular night, We were out there with the dog, facing the forest, with about 4 acres of my grandparents' yard between us and the forest. We began to hear loud screams that didn't sound like human, fox, nor owl. Not to mention the closest home was a mile or 2 away. Then all of a sudden, my husky started barking at something in the field, and my ex and I assumed it would be a deer or something like that, as only the dog could see it. The field was big and it was hard to see, so we calmed down the dog and continued to ignore him until he began snarling. I got down to the dog's level and tried to see which area of the field he was looking at, and tried to focus my eyes. I saw a tall figure, and it made this screeching sound that I would constantly hear all the time. Instead of trying to run after it, my dog on a leash tried to run away, so my ex and I bolted inside, as she also saw it. Take it as you will, but when I lived in that house, when I was alone, I felt like I was constantly being watched. Even when I would walk upstairs and have to run up them, I felt something was behind me that I couldn't see. I had a dream the other night, an elusive dream, to remind you that I was with a guy whom I've never seen, but this guy seemed familiar. He had headphones on, listening to music, the big over-ear studio headphones. He proceeded to take the headphones off and place them on my head, and a folk rock song started to play, as clear as day, a song I've never heard in my life. All of a sudden, after I heard the music, the guy morphed into a gray-brown type alien, and my surroundings changed. All of a sudden, I was lying on some medical procedure table inside a craft, and I instantly awoke and started crying. The alien in my dreams looked all the same with insane detail. Anytime I think about that event, seeing the tall shadow figure behind my door after closing it as a child makes me cry and sends chills throughout my whole body. Thank you for letting me share my stories. They have bothered me my whole life. I haven't shared these events and dreams with anyone except my current girlfriend. I'm 31 years old and figured it was time to share, regardless of what people think of me. I was geocaching once, and as I was wandering through the woods, I came across a small patch of trees that had Mr. Potato Head faces nailed to them. I was a 15-kilometer drive from civilization and nowhere near a trail. As the cache was deep in the woods, I contacted the cache owner, and he swore that they weren't there when he put the cache together. It was his private land, so nobody should have put them there. The other instance of weirdness was when I was hitchhiking and decided to set up camp off in the woods, not far from the highway. I had a fire, ate, and set up my little tent, and fell asleep without a problem. I woke up in the middle of the night due to some heavy breathing outside my tent. I listened for a bit, scared shitless, and then heard some movement, and the sound was gone. I woke up the next morning, and there was a photo of my family stuck with a nail to a tree right beside my tent, and fresh footprints in the dirt. Being the idiot that I am, I followed the path of the footprints a kilometer or so back into the woods, where it ended at a road. Across the street was an abandoned house. While checking out the house for anything useful, I found several photos of people from the photo, individuals' headshots, and notes apologizing for not protecting them or being there for them. I got a feeling like I wasn't alone and decided to make an exit. As I came out of the house, there was a pickup truck in the road watching me leave. He offered me a ride back to the highway and some food and drink, and told me all about the family that lived there and how they had all died. Apparently, the father had an accident while driving and struck an oncoming vehicle with the mother and 2 kids inside. He lived when everybody else died. A couple of years ago, me and some friends had a short-lived phase of trying to go to as many cool abandoned places as we could. One of these was a very old hospital that had been closed down for roughly 20 to 30 years. It was pretty central in a big town, so it was quite regularly maintained in terms of boarding up windows and stuff. Our first visit started with us climbing through a window near the middle of the building. We managed to pry a plywood board up from the window, but as soon as my 3 other friends and I got into that room and opened the door into the main hallway, we all agreed pretty quickly that we shouldn't be there and left. This is unusual for us, as we clearly weren't scared of much if we were easily able to break and enter into a building in the middle of town. We had also never been scared or anxious of anything before, and it weirded us out to the point that we all agreed to leave immediately. Our second visit is where it got proper weird. We went back around 2 weeks later, and all of the plywood on the windows was replaced with metal sheets, which isn't strange for a building in a large town where people are trying to break in regularly. Apart from the fact that the window we went through originally was completely open, we climbed through anyway and all got the same feelings again. Except when we tried to open the door into the hallway, it was locked and felt as if something was pushed up against it on the other side. We left back through the window, and I was last. I was about halfway out the window when I heard a young girl laugh pretty much directly behind me in this small room, and I nearly fell out of the window trying to get away from it. I thought it was just my mind being weird at first, until one of my friends asked if I heard the laugh, and if that's why I jumped through this window. All my other friends heard it too, and said it sounded like it came from that room. All of this is pretty normal stuff, and I'm sure the door being locked and having something behind it was just someone moving stuff around inside. But the young girl's laugh we all heard in the room we were in, and we felt that feeling on both visits.